a black teenage boy rushes into a hospital, cradling two pale white infants in his arms. One baby is barely breathing. Frantic and exhausted, the boys insist they found the twins in a burning car on the side of the road. But as the doctor begins to ask questions, doubts and suspicions start to swirl. Who is this black boy? Where did the babies come from? And what shocking secrets are about to turn this small-town hospital upside down? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Marcus's boots crunched against fallen leaves as he and Tyrell made their way home from Joe's diner. The October wind whistled through bare branches, making Tyrell pull his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The streetlights cast long shadows across their path, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the moon. "Man, my arms are killing me from all those dishes," Tyrell complained, rubbing his biceps dramatically. "How do you make it look so easy? My fingers are all pruny, and my back feels like I'm 90 years old." Marcus smiled at his younger brother, remembering how he'd felt the same way when he first started. "Practice, I guess. Plus, thinking about Grandma keeps me going. Every dollar we make helps her out. Remember how she used to work those double shifts at the grocery store?" "Yeah." Tyrell's voice softened and his shoulders slumped. "I saw her taking her medicine this morning. Her hands were shaking again. She tried to hide it, but I noticed." Marcus's jaw tightened and his chest ached with worry. Their grandmother had raised them since they were little, working 2 jobs until her health started failing. She'd never complained, not once, even during those long nights when she'd come home exhausted. Now it was their turn to help her, even if it meant scrubbing dishes and mopping floors after school. "We'll figure something out," Marcus assured him, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maybe we can pick up extra—" He stopped mid-sentence, his body tensing. In the distance, an orange glow pierced the darkness, angry and bright against the night sky. Thick smoke billowed upward, carried by the autumn wind. "Is that fire?" Tyrell squinted, his voice trembling slightly. Marcus's heart pounded against his ribs like a drum. "Something's wrong! Come on!" They broke into a run, their footsteps echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Following the glow, they reached a stretch of empty highway where the pavement was still warm from the day's sun. There, in a shallow ditch, a car was engulfed in flames. The heat hit them like a wall, singeing their eyebrows and making their eyes water. Then they heard it, tiny, desperate cries coming from inside the burning vehicle. The sound cut through the roar of the flames, making Marcus's blood run cold. "Oh, God!" Tyrell whispered, his face pale as milk in the firelight. "There's someone in there!" Marcus was already moving, his body acting before his mind could process the danger. "Call 911, he shouted, rushing toward the car. The passenger door was slightly ajar, warped from the heat, and through the thick smoke, he could make out 2 car seats in the back, their plastic frames beginning to melt. Babies, 2 of them. "Tyrell, help me." Marcus reached through the smoke, his hands finding the first car seat's buckle. The plastic was hot enough to blister, but he managed to unfasten it. He pulled the screaming infant out, coughing as acrid smoke filled his lungs. Tyrell stood frozen at the edge of the ditch, terror written across his face like a headline. "Tyrell!" Marcus's voice cracked with desperation. "The other baby? Now!" Something in his brother's eyes changed, a switch flipping from fear to determination. Tyrell darted forward, reaching for the second car seat just as flames began licking at the roof's interior. His hands trembled, but he managed to free the second infant, his movements quick and precise despite his terror. They stumbled away from the car, each holding a crying baby. One of the twins wheezed terribly, struggling for air, tiny chest heaving with each labored breath. "Marcus, Tyrell's voice shook like autumn leaves. What if they think we did this? I saw headlights. Someone driving away fast. Like they were running from something. That doesn't matter right now, Marcus cut him off, checking the wheezing baby with gentle fingers. This one needs help. The hospital's closer than waiting for an ambulance. We can worry about everything else later. Tyrell clutched his twin tighter, rocking slightly. But, no buts. We run. Now. They took off through the darkness, their hearts pounding and lungs burning with every step. The baby's cries echoed through the night like sirens as they ran faster than they'd ever run before, past darkened houses and empty parking lots. After what felt like forever, the hospital's emergency sign came into view, its red letters promising salvation. Marcus and Tyrell burst through the ER doors, gasping for breath, their clothes reeking of smoke. "Help!" Marcus shouted, his voice raw and desperate. "Please! The babies! Car fire! One can't breathe right!" Medical staff swarmed around them as the twins' cries filled the lobby. Nurses gently took the infants while others peppered them with urgent questions. Marcus's legs felt like jelly, and beside him, Tyrell was shaking like a leaf in the wind. But they'd made it. They'd actually made it. Dr. Eleanor Hayes rubbed her tired eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital burning into her retinas after 12 grueling hours on shift. Her computer screen blurred and wavered as she tried to focus on updating her last patient files for the night. Just 15 more minutes, she told herself, and she could head home to her empty house where only silence awaited. The thought made her heart ache with familiar loneliness, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Suddenly, desperate shouts erupted from the ER lobby. "Help! Please, somebody help us! We need a doctor!" The raw panic in the voice sent chills down her spine. Eleanor's head snapped up, medical instincts kicking in instantly. She pushed away from her desk and rushed toward the commotion, her white coat billowing behind her like a sail. Her comfortable shoes squeaked against the freshly waxed floor as she ran. As she burst through the double doors, nearly losing her balance in her haste, she froze at the shocking sight before her. Two teenage boys stood in the center of the lobby, each cradling a tiny infant wrapped in what looked like their own jackets. The taller boy's face was smudged with dark soot, his clothes reeking of acrid smoke that made her nose wrinkle. The younger one trembled visibly, tears streaming down his cheeks as he clutched a baby who looked frighteningly still, almost lifeless. Their desperation was palpable in the air. "What's going on here?" Eleanor demanded, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. In her 15 years of experience, teenagers with babies usually meant trouble, runaways, or worse. Her mind raced through possible scenarios, none of them good. "Are these your children?" "No, ma'am," the older boy said firmly, meeting her gaze with surprising steadiness despite his disheveled appearance. "I'm Marcus Jones, and this is my brother Tyrell. We found these babies in a burning car on Highway 23, just past the Miller Creek Bridge. One of them's barely breathing. Please, you have to help." His voice carried a mix of authority and desperation that seemed beyond his years. Eleanor stepped closer, her trained eye examining the infant in Tyrell's arms. The baby's lips had a distinct bluish tinge, and its tiny chest barely moved. Her heart clenched at the sight. "Get these babies to the NICU, Stat!" she called out to the nurses who had gathered around, her voice cutting through the tension. "Page respiratory therapy and get warming blankets ready, and someone prep the oxygen therapy unit." As the nurses whisked the twins away with practiced efficiency, Eleanor noticed two burly security guards positioning themselves near the entrance, their eyes fixed intently on Marcus and Tyrell. The boys didn't seem to notice, their attention completely focused on the direction the babies had been taken, their faces etched with worry. Their body language spoke volumes about their investment in the infant's welfare. "Please," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly as he turned back to her. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and she could see small burns on his hands that he hadn't even seemed to notice. "Are they going to be okay? We tried to get here as fast as we could." Eleanor studied their faces carefully, the genuine concern in their eyes, the bone-deep exhaustion, the barely concealed traces of fear. Something in their expressions made her initial suspicion waver and then fade. These weren't troublemakers. They looked like scared kids who'd just been through something deeply traumatic. The rawness of their emotions struck a chord deep within her. "The babies are in critical condition," she explained, her tone softening as she gestured for them to sit in the nearby chairs. She noticed how they both winced slightly as they sat, their bodies clearly aching from their ordeal. "But they're getting the best care possible right now. I need you to tell me exactly what happened, every detail you can remember, no matter how small." Marcus described finding the burning car and hearing the baby's desperate cries through the flames. As he spoke, Eleanor noticed his hands were shaking uncontrollably, though his voice remained remarkably steady. His fingers kept absently touching a singed spot on his jacket sleeve. Terrell kept wiping his eyes with his sleeve, occasionally adding sharp details about the dark car they'd seen speeding away into the night, his words tumbling out between hitched breaths. "Listen," Eleanor said, glancing at the security guards who were now speaking urgently into their radios, their faces grim. "I've called Detective Nolan from the local police. They'll need to investigate this situation thoroughly. The babies are stable for now, but they're not out of danger yet. We need to figure out exactly what happened tonight." She reached out and briefly touched Marcus's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. The boys nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Eleanor saw no trace of deception in their faces, only genuine worry and bone-deep exhaustion from what must have been a terrifying and harrowing night. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under their eyes, making them look even younger and more vulnerable than they were. Detective Nolan's heavy footsteps echoed through the quiet hospital corridor as he approached the waiting room. His weathered face bore the exhaustion of too many late-night calls, too many cases where things weren't what they seemed. Dark circles under his eyes hinted at the countless hours spent chasing leads that often led nowhere. He found Marcus and Tyrell sitting side by side on plastic chairs, their clothes still smelling of smoke, their faces streaked with soot. "So," Nolan began, pulling up a chair and sitting heavily across from them, the metal legs scraping against the linoleum floor. "You boys want to tell me what really happened tonight?" Marcus sat up straighter, his voice steady despite his obvious exhaustion. "Like we told the doctors, sir. We were walking home from work when we saw the fire. We heard crying and found the babies in the car. We couldn't just leave them there." "Convenient story," Nolan said, his eyes narrowing as he studied their faces for any sign of deception. "Got a witness saying they saw two boys around that car right before it went up in flames. Care to explain that?" Terrell's leg bounced nervously, his sneaker tapping a rapid rhythm against the floor. "That was us trying to get the babies out. We didn't start the fire, I swear. We were just trying to help." "Tyrell," Marcus said softly, placing a calming hand on his brother's shoulder and giving it a gentle squeeze. "We're telling the truth, Detective. We work at Jerry's Diner. You can check with our boss. We were heading home when you just happened to become heroes?" Nolan interrupted, his tone dripping with skepticism, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, who had been observing from nearby while reviewing patient charts, stepped forward. "Detective, these boys brought those infants straight to us. If they had anything to hide, why would they do that? They were covered in burns and smoke residue from their rescue attempt." "People do strange things to cover their tracks, Doctor," Nolan replied, drumming his fingers on his notepad. Just then, Mrs. Jones hurried into the waiting room, her gray hair escaping from its usual neat bun, her worn cardigan hastily buttoned wrong. "Marcus? Tyrell? Oh, thank God you're all right." She embraced both boys tightly before turning to face Detective Nolan, drawing herself up to her full height. "What's going on here?" "Ma'am, we're investigating a suspicious vehicle fire," Nolan explained, his pen poised over his notebook. "Well, if my boys say they found those babies and saved them, then that's exactly what happened," Mrs. Jones declared firmly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "They've never given me cause to doubt their word. They work hard, study hard, and help me run the household since their parents passed. These boys know right from wrong." Eleanor watched the interaction closely, noting how Marcus kept his arm protectively around Tyrrell, how Mrs. Jones stood tall despite her obvious fatigue and worry lines. These weren't troublemakers. They were a family looking out for each other, bound together by love and trust. Nolan sighed, closing his notebook with a sharp snap. "All right, we'll look into it further. But don't leave town," he warned, pointing at Marcus and Tyrrell with his pen. "We'll have more questions." Eleanor sat in the dimly lit hospital break room, cradling a lukewarm cup of coffee between her hands. The bitter aroma did little to lift her spirits as fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Dr. Carter leaned against the counter, his arms crossed and his expression stern. His white coat wrinkled from a long overnight shift. "Those boys," Carter said, shaking his head, his fingers drumming against his sleeve. "You know their type, Eleanor. From the wrong side of town, probably looking for trouble. We see it all the time in the ER." Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same constricting feeling she got whenever someone made snap judgments. Their type? They're teenagers who work after school to help their grandmother. What type is that exactly? Her voice carried a sharp edge she rarely used with colleagues. Carter sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You know what I mean. Single-parent household, rough neighborhood. Things happen. We can't get personally involved in every case." "Things like saving 2 babies from a burning car?" Eleanor countered, setting her cup down with more force than intended. Coffee sloshed over the rim, creating a small puddle on the scratched break room table. The conversation stirred memories of her own prejudices, assumptions she'd made when the boys first burst into the ER, covered in soot and desperation. But something about their genuine concern, their exhaustion, and their unwavering focus on the baby's well-being had touched her heart, breaking through years of professional detachment. Later that morning, Marcus and Tyrrell stood at the NICU window, their faces pressed close to the glass, leaving smudged fingerprints that reflected their anxious vigilance. A kind-faced nurse named Sarah invited them in for a closer look, helping them sanitize their hands and put on protective gowns with practiced efficiency. "They're fighters," Sarah said softly, leading them to the incubators where machines beeped steadily. "Both breathing much better now. Their oxygen levels have improved significantly since they arrived." Tyrrell wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide his emotion, but his trembling shoulders gave him away. Marcus stepped closer, his expression tender as he watched the tiny chests rise and fall beneath the tangle of monitoring wires. "Hope," he whispered, touching the first incubator gently with his gloved hand. "And faith," he added, looking at the second baby, his voice thick with emotion. "Because that's what we need right now. Hope and faith that the truth will come out." Eleanor watched this scene unfold from the doorway, her heart swelling with certainty. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the floor, but she saw these boys with perfect clarity. These weren't troublemakers or criminals. These were good kids caught in an extraordinary situation, showing more character than many adults she knew. Making up her mind, she grabbed her car keys from her pocket, determined to visit Mrs. Jones and learn more about the family who had raised such remarkable young men. As Marcus and Tyrell left the NICU, Eleanor noticed their lingering glances at the twins, their obvious concern for the babies they'd saved. Their shoulders were hunched with exhaustion, but they walked tall, carrying the weight of their responsibility with quiet dignity. Despite Dr. Carter's warnings echoing in her mind, she felt more certain than ever about standing by these boys, regardless of the consequences to her career or reputation. Eleanor parked her car in front of the small, well-maintained house. Though the paint was peeling and the front steps sagged slightly, cheerful potted marigolds brightened the porch. She took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and walked to the door. Before she could knock, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Jones, a petite woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "Dr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. "What brings you here?" "Please, call me Eleanor. I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I wanted to talk about Marcus and Tyrell." Mrs. Jones hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Come in, dear. I just made some fresh coffee." The living room was small but immaculate. Framed photos lined the walls, a younger couple smiling at their wedding, two small boys playing in a park, school portraits showing Marcus and Tyrell growing up through the years. "Those are their parents," Mrs. Jones said softly, noticing Eleanor's gaze on the wedding photo. "My son James and his wife Sarah. We lost them 5 years ago. Black ice on the highway." She settled into a worn armchair, hands folded in her lap. Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry. I know what it's like to lose family suddenly." She paused, then added quietly, "My husband Tom and our daughter Lucy, drunk driver, 3 years ago." Mrs. Jones reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand. For a moment, they sat in understanding silence. From the kitchen came the sounds of cabinets opening and closing. "Boys," Mrs. Jones called out, "what are you up to?" "Making Mrs. Rodriguez casserole, Grandma," Marcus answered. "Remember, she just had her knee surgery." "Tyrell's actually following the recipe this time," came Marcus's teasing voice, followed by a good-natured "Hey" from his brother. Mrs. Jones smiled proudly. "They're good boys, Dr. Hayes. They work so hard, at school, at their jobs, here at home. I've tried my best to teach them right from wrong, to help others when they can." Her eyes grew misty. "Sometimes I worry it's not enough living in this neighborhood, but they've never given me reason to doubt them." Eleanor watched through the kitchen doorway as Marcus carefully measured ingredients while Tyrell stirred the pot, the brothers working in comfortable sync. Their grandmother's words rang true. These weren't troublemakers or criminals. They were just kids trying their best to do the right thing. Detective Nolan stood at the weathered counter of the Gas and Go, his notepad open. The attendant, a middle-aged man with oil-stained hands, leaned forward. "Yeah, I remember that car clear as day. One of them fancy German ones, all black and shiny. Stuck out like a sore thumb around here." At the hospital, Marcus and Tyrell sat in the waiting area while Eleanor reviewed the twins' charts nearby. They perked up when they heard her mention black luxury sedan to a nurse. "Marcus," Tyrell whispered urgently, tugging his brother's sleeve. "That's got to be the car we saw taking off, right? The one with those bright LED headlights?" Marcus nodded slowly. "We should tell Dr. Hayes." Before they could approach her, Eleanor's phone rang. Her face grew serious as she listened. "Emily Cartwright," she repeated, loud enough for the boys to hear. "The twins' mother?" She scribbled something in her notes. "And she died last week?" The boys watched as Eleanor's expression darkened. She paced the hallway, speaking in hushed tones about suspicious circumstances and the Cartwright estate. When she hung up, Marcus cleared his throat. "Dr. Hayes, we need to tell you something about that car." Eleanor pulled up a chair. "What is it?" "We saw a black sedan speeding away from the scene," Marcus explained. It had these really bright headlights. We couldn't make out much else because of the fire, but... Why's this taking so long? Terrell burst out, his frustration evident. We saved those babies, but everyone's looking at us like we did something wrong. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Terrell's shoulder. I believe you both, and I promise I'm going to figure out what's really going on here. The twins' mother came from a very wealthy family, and something about her death doesn't add up. Marcus and Tyrell exchanged glances as Eleanor was called away to check on a patient. Did you hear that name? Marcus whispered. Cartwright. Tyrell pulled out his phone. Let's see what we can find out about them. The boys huddled together, their fingers flying over the phone screen as they began their search for answers about the mysterious Cartwright family. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated Marcus and Tyrell's faces as they huddled together in their small bedroom. Their grandmother had already gone to bed, leaving the house quiet except for the gentle hum of the ancient computer. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to a news article. Emily Cartwright, 28, found dead in her home last Tuesday. Police investigating suspicious circumstances. Tyrell leaned closer, his eyes scanning the text. It says she came from one of the richest families in town. The Cartwrights own like half the businesses here. Marcus clicked through more articles, his expression growing more serious. Here's something about a family fight. Emily was cut off from the family money 2 years ago when she refused to join the family business. Wait, Tyrell said, tapping the screen. This article mentions she had twin daughters. That's got to be them, right? They found another piece about James Cartwright, Emily's older brother. The photo showed a well-dressed man with cold eyes and a practiced smile. Says here he's taking over as CEO of Cartwright Industries, Marcus read. And look, if Emily's kids aren't around, he gets everything. The next morning they met Eleanor in the hospital cafeteria, sharing their discoveries over untouched cups of hot chocolate. Eleanor listened intently, her medical ID badge catching the fluorescent light as she leaned forward. We think James Cartwright might have something to do with this, Marcus explained, his voice low. The timing's too perfect. His sister dies, then someone tries to get rid of her babies? Tyrell fidgeted with his cup. Nobody believes us about finding the car. But what if he was the one who left it there? What if he's trying to make sure nobody stops him from getting all the money? Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on Tyrell's shoulder. I believe you both, she said firmly. And I promise you, I'm going to look into this myself. The Cartwright family might have influence in this town, but they're not above the law. Marcus stared down at the table. It's just frustrating. Everyone looks at us like we're lying, like we did something wrong, but we were just trying to help. I know, Eleanor said softly, and that's exactly what makes me trust you. You ran toward danger to save those babies, not away from it. When they returned home that evening, Marcus shut down the laptop with a sigh. Something caught his eye through the window. A dark car parked across the street, its windows tinted black. His heart quickened as he realized someone was watching their house. Marcus stood at the curb early the next morning, his heart pounding as he approached the dark sedan that had been parked outside their house all night. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but he could make out the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. Hey, Marcus called out, trying to keep his voice steady. Why are you watching our house? The engine suddenly roared to life. Marcus stepped closer, determined to get answers, but the car lurched forward, forcing him to jump back. The sedan sped away, leaving only the smell of burning rubber behind. Tyrell rushed out of the house, his eyes wide. Marcus, are you okay? Yeah, Marcus said, memorizing the car's make and model. But something's definitely not right. Later that morning at the hospital, they told Eleanor about the mysterious car. She listened intently, her forehead creased with concern. "I'm taking this to Detective Nolan right away," she said, leading them to the police officer stationed in the hospital lobby. But Nolan just shook his head when Eleanor explained the situation. "A car parked on a public street isn't evidence of anything, Dr. Hayes, and without a license plate number, we can't investigate." "But combined with everything else," Eleanor started. "Everything else is circumstantial," Nolan cut her off. "We have no proof connecting the Cartwrights to any of this." Eleanor watched him walk away, her jaw tight with frustration. She returned to her office and pulled up her computer, determined to find answers herself. She spent hours researching the Cartwright family, uncovering article after article about James Cartwright's business dealings. Hostile takeovers, whistleblower lawsuits, settlement agreements, she muttered, taking notes. One headline caught her eye. "Cartwright Heir Contest Sister's Will, months before tragic death." Eleanor sat back in her chair, pieces clicking into place. James Cartwright had tried to invalidate Emily's will before she died, a will that would have made her twin daughters the primary heirs to her share of the family fortune. She glanced at her watch, then grabbed her coat. There was only one way to get real answers. She had to go straight to the source. 20 minutes later, Eleanor pulled up to the gates of the Cartwright estate. The massive iron gates loomed before her, and beyond them stood a sprawling mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. She took a deep breath, straightening her white coat. She would pose as a concerned doctor, there to discuss the twins' medical care with their uncle. Looking up at the imposing structure, Eleanor felt small and out of her depth. But the image of Marcus and Tyrell's earnest faces and those innocent babies in the NICU steeled her resolve. She reached for the intercom button. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove through the ornate iron gates of the Cartwright estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade gleaming in the morning sun. Perfectly manicured gardens stretched in every direction, but there was something sterile about their precision. A butler led her through the grand entrance hall, their footsteps echoing against marble floors. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting rainbow prisms on the walls. Yet despite all the luxury, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. James Cartwright met her in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and dark wood paneling. He wore an expensive suit and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dr. Hayes, what a pleasure," he said smoothly, gesturing to a leather chair. "How can I help you?" Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor. "I'm here about 2 infant girls recently brought to our hospital. We've identified them as Emily's daughters." James's expression flickered for just a moment. "Emily's daughters? I had no idea where they were after her. Unfortunate passing." "They were rescued from a burning car 3 nights ago," Eleanor said carefully, watching his reaction. "How terrible," James replied, but his tone remained oddly detached. "I've been so consumed with business matters, I'm afraid I've been rather disconnected from family affairs." When Eleanor pressed about the night of the fire, James waved his hand dismissively. "I was at a board meeting that evening. The inheritance situation has been keeping us quite busy." "Inheritance?" Eleanor prompted. "Oh, just tedious legal matters," James said, suddenly standing. "I'm afraid I have another appointment." As Eleanor walked to her car, she noticed a black luxury sedan parked near the garage. It matched Marcus and Tyrell's description perfectly. The same make, model, and even the dark-tinted windows. She drove away slowly, her mind racing. James's polished exterior couldn't quite hide his nervous energy when she'd mentioned the fire, and that casual mention of inheritance, combined with his apparent lack of concern for his nieces. Eleanor's suspicions hardened into certainty. James Cartwright knew far more than he was willing to admit. The afternoon sun glinted off the water as Eleanor pulled into the marina's gravel parking lot. Salt air and the creaking of boat ropes filled the air. She walked along the weathered wooden dock, scanning the boats until she spotted an older man in faded overalls fixing a motor. "Excuse me, are you Charlie?" she asked, approaching carefully. He looked up, squinting against the sun. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "I'm Dr. Eleanor Hayes. I wanted to ask you about Emily Cartwright." Charlie's weathered face softened. "Emily? Sweet girl, that one? Terrible, what happened?" He set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "Used to come here all the time with those baby girls of hers." "Did you notice anything unusual before her accident?" Charlie leaned against a post, his expression troubled. "Matter of fact, I did. Week before it happened, she was real nervous-like. Said she'd had some kind of fight with that brother of hers, James." He shook his head. "Never liked him myself. Too slick by half." "Did she say what the fight was about?" "Money, I reckon. She was worried. Told me she didn't feel safe." Charlie's voice dropped lower. "Strange thing is, I saw James here the night before she died. Never saw him at the marina before that." Eleanor's heart quickened. "Are you sure it was him?" "Clear as day. Hard to mistake that fancy car of his. One of them big silver luxury jobs." Just then, Eleanor's phone buzzed. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. "Dr. Hayes." His voice was tight with worry. "That car's back. The same one from before. It's just sitting there, watching our house." "Stay inside," Eleanor instructed firmly. "Lock all the doors and windows. I'm heading back now." She thanked Charlie quickly and hurried to her car, her mind racing. James's presence at the marina, Emily's fears, the mysterious car. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a disturbing picture. As she drove back toward town, Eleanor's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She needed proof, something concrete that would connect James to both Emily's death and the attempt on the twins' lives. But she knew she had to move carefully. James Cartwright was powerful, and he clearly had resources at his disposal. Marcus and Terrell walked into the hospital's fluorescent-lit lobby, their shoes squeaking on the polished floor. The twins had been on their minds all night, keeping them from sleep. As they rounded the corner toward the NICU, they nearly collided with Detective Nolan. "Just the two I wanted to see," Nolan said, his voice gruff. "Any reason you boys have been asking questions about James Cartwright?" Marcus straightened his shoulders. "We saw his car, Detective. The same luxury sedan that was at the fire." "That's a pretty serious accusation," Nolan replied, crossing his arms. "You know how many black sedans are in this town?" "But we also know about Emily," Terrell added quietly, "about her fighting with James over money." Nolan's expression hardened. "Look, I get that you two want to play heroes, but the Cartwrights are respected members of this community. You can't just throw around accusations without proof." "Respected?" Marcus's voice rose. "Or just rich? Is that why you won't investigate? Because he has money and we don't?" Terrell grabbed his brother's arm. "Marcus, calm down." "No!" Marcus pulled away. "Everyone knows James Cartwright gets special treatment. Those babies could have died." Eleanor appeared from around the corner, her white coat swishing as she walked quickly toward them. "What's going on here?" "These boys are making wild accusations about James Cartwright," Nolan said. "They're not wild accusations," Eleanor countered. "There's enough circumstantial evidence to warrant looking into it. The timing of Emily's death, the inheritance dispute, the car at the scene." Nolan rubbed his temple. "Dr. Hayes, with all due respect." "With all due respect, Detective," Eleanor interrupted, "two infants nearly died. Don't they deserve a thorough investigation, regardless of who might be involved?" After a long moment, Nolan sighed. Fine, I'll look into it. But you all need to stay out of this. Let me handle it through proper channels. He pointed at Marcus and Tyrell. That means no more amateur detective work. Understood? The boys nodded reluctantly. After Nolan left, Eleanor pulled out her phone. I know someone who might be able to help. Clara Thompson from the local paper. She's been investigating the Cartwright's business dealings for months. Can we trust her? Marcus asked. She's thorough and discreet, Eleanor assured them. If there's anything to find, she'll find it. Eleanor watched as Marcus and Tyrell headed toward the NICU for their visit with the twins. Their shoulders were tense, but their steps were determined. She pulled up Clara's number, hoping this would be the breakthrough they needed. Eleanor sat across from Clara at the Sweet Bean Cafe, stirring her untouched coffee. The journalist's dark eyes sparkled with interest as Eleanor explained the situation. So you think James Cartwright tried to get rid of his own nieces? Clara leaned forward, lowering her voice. I can't prove it, Eleanor replied, but something's not right. The timing of Emily's death, then the fire. Clara pulled out her laptop. I've been looking into the Cartwrights already. James has been making some interesting transactions. She turned the screen toward Eleanor, showing a series of bank records. Look at these payments to a man named Rick Morton. He's got priors for arson. Eleanor's hand trembled as she set down her coffee cup. Can you prove the connection? Working on it, Clara said, typing rapidly. But there's more. James filed a challenge to Emily's will 3 weeks before she died. He claimed she was mentally unfit to manage the family fortune. At the hospital, Marcus and Tyrell stood at the NICU window, their faces brightening as they watched the twins. Both babies had more color now, their tiny chests rising and falling steadily. They're fighters, Marcus said softly, pressing his hand against the glass. Tyrell nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. Like us. Eleanor joined them, smiling at the sight of the improving infants. They're doing much better, but we need to stay alert. James Cartwright is dangerous. Dr. Hayes? A nurse approached, holding an envelope. This came for you. Eleanor opened it, her face paling as she read the typed message. Drop the investigation or face the consequences. Some stories are better left untold. She glanced at Marcus and Tyrell, who were still watching the twins with protective expressions. Looking back at the threat in her hands, Eleanor felt her jaw set with determination. These boys had risked everything to save 2 innocent lives. She wouldn't let them down now. Eleanor stared at the plain brown package on her desk, her heart racing as she carefully opened it. Inside, she found a worn leather-bound diary and a handwritten note. The message was brief but clear. She feared for her life. This may help you. Her hands shook slightly as she opened Emily Cartwright's diary. The first few entries were ordinary enough. Daily routines, thoughts about the twins' development, small joys of motherhood. But as Eleanor turned the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. James came by again today, one entry read. He was asking about Dad's will, about the trust fund for the girls. Something in his eyes scared me. It wasn't like when we were kids anymore. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She continued reading, each page revealing more of Emily's growing terror. I have to get out of here, another entry stated. James isn't himself anymore. The money has changed him. Yesterday, he said the twins were complications that needed to be dealt with. I'm terrified of what he might do. The final entries made Eleanor's blood run cold. Emily described a heated confrontation with James in his study. He threatened me today, Emily had written in shaky handwriting. Said he'd take everything, my inheritance, my home, even my babies. You won't see it coming, he said. One day, you'll just disappear. Eleanor immediately called Clara, who arrived within the hour. As they pored over the diary together, Marcus and Tyrell burst into her office, both looking pale and worried. "The car's back," Marcus said, his voice tight with concern. "It's been following us everywhere." Tyrell nodded, fidgeting with his sleeve. "We saw it outside school, then at the diner, and now it's parked near our house." Eleanor looked at the boys' frightened faces, then at Emily's diary. She couldn't let history repeat itself. "Pack some bags," she said firmly. "You're staying with me until this is over." Clara held up the diary. "This could be exactly what we need." Emily's own words, documenting James's threats and erratic behavior. As Eleanor made arrangements for the boys, she turned to Emily's final diary entry. The words seemed to leap off the page. "If anything happens to me, protect my babies. They're all that matters now." Eleanor's phone buzzed just as she was finishing dinner with Marcus and Tyrell. Detective Nolan's gruff voice came through the speaker. "Bad news, Doc. The sedan was rented with fake credentials. Trail's gone cold." Eleanor's heart sank. "There must be something else we can look into." "We're doing what we can," Nolan replied, his tone flat. "But without solid evidence, our hands are tied." After hanging up, Eleanor called Clara, who answered on the first ring. "The sedan lead didn't pan out," Eleanor explained. "Don't worry," Clara said firmly. "I'm following the money. James Cartwright isn't as careful as he thinks. I found some interesting transfers, large sums to an offshore account. The account holder? A man with previous arson convictions." In the living room, Marcus and Tyrell sat on Eleanor's comfortable but worn couch. Tyrell hugged his knees to his chest. "What if we just made everything worse?" Tyrell whispered. "Maybe we should have called 911 and run." Marcus put an arm around his brother's shoulders. "Hey, those babies are alive because of us. We did the right thing." "But what if?" "No what ifs," Marcus said firmly. "We saved them. That's what matters." The phone rang again, making everyone jump. Eleanor answered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Back off," a distorted voice warned, "or you'll regret it." The line went dead. Eleanor's hands trembled as she sent the recording to Clara. She walked into the living room, where Marcus and Tyrell watched her with worried eyes. "Are we safe here?" Tyrell asked quietly. Eleanor double-checked each window and door lock. "Yes," she assured them, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We're safe here together." Marcus and Tyrell stood at the NICU window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched the twins. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting warm stripes across the babies' incubators. "Look how strong they're getting," Marcus said softly, placing his hand against the glass. Little Lily kicked her feet, while Grace clutched a tiny stuffed bear a nurse had given her. Tyrell smiled, his earlier fears momentarily forgotten. "They're fighters, just like us." A gentle hand touched their shoulders. Eleanor had joined them, her white coat crisp in the morning light. She watched the twins with them, remembering that first chaotic night when the boys had burst through the ER doors. "They've come so far," she said. "The nurses say they're responding well to treatment." As they walked through the hospital corridor later, Detective Nolan's heavy footsteps echoed behind them. His face was grim. "Got some new witnesses coming forward," he said, his tone skeptical, "claiming they saw you boys hanging around before the fire started. But something's off about their stories. Details don't match up." Marcus's shoulders tensed. "They're lying?" "Half the town's already decided we did it," Tyrell added quietly. "Just because of where we live." Eleanor felt her phone vibrate. A text from Clara lit up the screen. "Emergency. Call ASOP. When Eleanor called later that evening, Clara's voice crackled with excitement. "I found something big. James filed a claim on Emily's life insurance policy 3 days before she died. The paperwork was already in motion." Eleanor sank into her desk chair, staring at Emily's diary. "He was planning it all along." "There's more," Clara continued. "The policy was worth millions. And guess what? It specifically excluded the twins as beneficiaries." Eleanor spread the documents across her desk, connecting the pieces. James's greed, Emily's fear, the twins' attempted murder, it all pointed to a desperate man's scheme to claim the family fortune, no matter the cost. The night air grew heavy as she studied the evidence, her office lamp casting long shadows across the walls. She thought of Marcus and Tyrell, 2 brave boys who had unknowingly disrupted a calculated plan, and of Lily and Grace, innocent babies who stood between their uncle and millions of dollars. Clara's voice crackled with excitement over Eleanor's phone early that morning. "I found it, Eleanor. A letter from Emily to her lawyer. You need to see this." Eleanor met Clara at a small coffee shop downtown. Clara's hands shook as she passed over copies of the letter. Emily knew James was after her. She spelled it all out. The letter was clear and damning. Emily's neat handwriting detailed her brother's threats, his rage over her plans to name the twins as sole heirs. "James swore he would take care of everything if I didn't change my will," Emily had written. "I fear for my life and my babies." Within the hour, Eleanor and Clara sat across from Emily's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, in his wood-paneled office. He pulled the original letter from a manila envelope. "Emily was terrified," he said, adjusting his glasses. "She wanted this on record in case anything happened to her." Back at Eleanor's house, Marcus and Tyrell listened intently as she explained the letter's contents. For the first time in days, hope flickered in Marcus's eyes. "So this proves James was behind everything?" Tyrell asked. Before Eleanor could answer, heavy knocks rattled her front door. 2 police officers stood on her porch, their faces stern. "Marcus and Tyrell Jones," one officer said. "You're under arrest for suspected arson." "What? No!" Eleanor stepped between them and the boys. "This is ridiculous!" "We have a witness who saw them running from the scene," the officer stated flatly. "They need to come with us." Marcus stayed calm as they handcuffed him, but Tyrell's lower lip trembled. "Dr. Hayes, please help us," he whispered. "I'll fix this," Eleanor promised, her heart breaking as she watched them being led to the police car. "Don't say anything until we get you a lawyer." She grabbed her phone and dialed Clara. "They've arrested the boys. We need to move fast." "I'll start working on the story right now," Clara assured her. "We'll expose James and his lies." The police car's red and blue lights flashed against Eleanor's windows as it pulled away. She pressed her hand against the glass, watching Marcus and Tyrell disappear into the night. Her jaw set with determination. James Cartwright wasn't going to get away with this. Early morning sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds in Mr. Paulson's office as Eleanor and Clara settled into leather chairs across from his imposing oak desk. The lawyer's hands trembled slightly as he retrieved a thick manila envelope from his safe. "I should have done more," Mr. Paulson said, his voice heavy with regret. "Emily came to me several times, each visit more desperate than the last." He carefully extracted Emily's letter, handling it like a precious artifact. This was her last visit, just 3 days before the boating accident. She insisted I keep this letter sealed unless something happened to her. Eleanor leaned forward as Mr. Paulson began reading. Emily's words painted a chilling picture of James's escalating threats. "He cornered me in the garden," Emily had written. "Said he wouldn't let me ruin the family legacy by giving everything to my girls. When I refused to change my will, he told me he would take care of everything himself." Clara photographed each page methodically, her journalist training evident in her careful documentation. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "The public needs to know the truth." While they worked, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to Marcus and Terrell. She'd visited them yesterday at the juvenile detention center. Marcus had maintained his composure, sitting straight-backed in his orange jumpsuit. But she'd noticed how his hands clenched when describing the guard's cold treatment. Tyrell hadn't been able to hide his fear, his usual energy replaced by nervous fidgeting. "We'll get you out," she'd promised them. "Just stay strong a little longer." After leaving Mr. Paulson's office, Eleanor called Detective Nolan. His gruff voice suggested he'd been waiting for her call. "I heard you found new evidence," he said. "Emily's letter proves James had motive and made threats. You need to reopen this investigation." There was a long pause before Nolan sighed. "Bring it to the station. I'll take a look." Eleanor clutched her copy of the letter, feeling its weight, not just the paper, but the responsibility it represented. Emily's words could finally bring justice for her daughters and clear Marcus and Tyrell's names. The Cartwright estate loomed before them, its manicured lawns and stone facade, a monument to wealth and privilege. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tighter as she parked in the circular driveway, Emily's letter secure in her purse. "Ready?" Clara asked, checking her phone's recording app one last time. Eleanor nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." James Cartwright answered the door himself, his practiced smile failing to mask his surprise. "Dr. Hayes, and who might this be?" "Clara Thompson," Clara replied smoothly. "We need to discuss Emily." James's smile tightened, but he gestured them inside. "Of course. My study?" The room was exactly as Eleanor remembered. Dark wood, leather chairs, and the overwhelming sense of old money. James settled behind his massive desk, a position of power he clearly preferred. "We have Emily's letter," Eleanor said without preamble, sliding the document across his desk. "The one she wrote to Mr. Paulson days before her death." James barely glanced at it. "And?" "She knew you were planning something," Clara pressed. "She documented your threats." "Threats?" James laughed, but his fingers drummed nervously on his desk. "My sister was troubled, imagining dangers everywhere." "Like the danger of a mysterious car fire?" Eleanor asked. "Or suspicious financial transfers to known arsonists?" James's face darkened. "You're treading dangerous ground, Doctor. Both of you. Accusations without proof can lead to unfortunate consequences." Clara leaned forward. "We have proof, Mr. Cartwright. Bank records, witness statements, Emily's letter. The public might find it fascinating." "The public?" James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood. "You really don't want to do that. Stories can be damaging to everyone involved." Eleanor met his glare steadily. "Is that a threat, James?" "Consider it friendly advice," he said, voice low. "Drop this now, before things get unpleasant." Clara gathered her belongings with deliberate slowness. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Cartwright." Back in the car, Clara replayed the recording, James's threats now preserved as evidence. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "Combined with everything else." "Then let's not waste any time," Eleanor replied, starting the engine. "It's time everyone knew the truth about James Cartwright." The courthouse buzzed with tension as Marcus and Terrell were led into the courtroom, their hands free, but their shoulders heavy with worry. Eleanor's heart ached, seeing them in their borrowed suits, looking so young and vulnerable. Judge Reynolds, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, surveyed the courtroom with sharp eyes. "Preliminary hearing in the matter of State versus Marcus and Tyrell Jones," she announced, her voice carrying authority through the wooden chamber. Eleanor took the stand first, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Those boys ran straight to our hospital, exhausted and terrified, but thinking only of saving those babies," she testified, her voice clear and passionate. "They visited the twins every day since, showing nothing but concern for their welfare." Clara followed, presenting her findings with professional precision. She pulled up photographs of Emily's letter on the courtroom screen, the words stark and damning. "James has threatened me again. He says if I don't change my will, he'll take everything, including my babies." The recording of James's veiled threats played next, his controlled facade cracking under pressure. Clara then displayed bank statements showing substantial payments from James's account to a known arsonist just days before the fire. Detective Nolan shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Clara outlined the police's failure to investigate these connections. "Your Honor," Clara concluded, "the evidence clearly points away from these boys and toward James Cartwright, who had both motive and means." Judge Reynolds studied the documents before her expression grave. "I find insufficient evidence to proceed with charges against Marcus and Terrell Jones at this time," she declared. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into James Cartwright's possible involvement in both the fire and Emily Cartwright's death." Marcus and Terrell sagged with relief as the judge set a reasonable bail amount, which Eleanor had already arranged to pay. Outside the courthouse, a small group of supporters had gathered, holding signs reading, "Justice for Marcus and Terrell," and "Heroes, not criminals." As the boys emerged into the sunlight, the crowd broke into applause and cheers. Marcus turned to Eleanor, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in us." Detective Nolan pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the Cartwright estate, his squad car followed by 3 police vehicles. His usual skepticism had been replaced by grim determination. The warrant felt heavy in his jacket pocket. "James Cartwright," he called through the intercom. "This is Detective Nolan. We have a warrant for your arrest." The gates swung open slowly. James stood on his marble steps, still wearing his expensive suit, though his usual composure had slipped. His neighbors gathered at the edges of their properties, phones raised to capture the scene. "This is ridiculous," James said, but his voice trembled. "You have no grounds." "We have plenty," Nolan cut him off, producing the warrant. "James Cartwright, you're under arrest for the murder of Emily Cartwright and attempted murder of her children." As officers led James away in handcuffs, others began searching the mansion. In his study, they discovered a hidden safe containing damning evidence, receipts for payments to known arsonist Mickey Torres, emails discussing Emily's removal from the picture, and detailed plans about the twins' inheritance. James's personal assistant cracked under questioning, revealing how James had orchestrated Emily's boating accident and arranged the car fire to eliminate the twins as heirs. His lawyer followed suit, providing copies of threatening emails James had sent to Emily. At the hospital, Marcus and Terrell stood at the NICU window, watching the twins sleep peacefully. Eleanor joined them, her heart full, seeing the gentle way both boys touched the glass. "They're getting stronger every day," Eleanor said softly. "Just like us," Terrell replied, managing a small smile. The tension they'd carried for weeks began to fade as news spread of James's arrest. Eleanor's phone buzzed, her lawyer calling with life-changing news about her petition to adopt the twins. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to the boys. "The adoption's been approved," she whispered. "They're going to be my daughters." Marcus and Tyrell broke into genuine smiles for the first time since that fateful night, the weight of suspicion finally lifting from their shoulders. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Eleanor's house as she carried the twins' car seats inside. Marcus and Tyrell followed close behind, their arms full of baby supplies from the hospital. Eleanor's heart swelled with joy as she looked at Lily and Grace, both healthy and strong after their ordeal. "Let's get their room ready," Eleanor said softly, leading the way upstairs to the spare bedroom. The walls were already painted a soft yellow, and white curtains fluttered in the breeze. Marcus carefully assembled the cribs, while Tyrell arranged stuffed animals and blankets. Eleanor watched them work, touched by their gentleness with the baby's things. "You're naturals at this," she said, smiling, as Tyrell carefully folded tiny onesies. Marcus paused from his work, his expression serious. "I just keep thinking about that night," he said quietly. "What if we hadn't found them in time?" Eleanor set down the mobile she was holding and sat beside him. "But you did find them. You were exactly where you needed to be." Tyrell moved closer to his brother, and Eleanor could see the deep bond between them. Marcus's eyes grew misty as he looked at his younger brother. "Sometimes I worry," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "about losing Tyrell, about not being able to protect him enough." Eleanor reached out and took both boys' hands in hers. "You're not alone anymore," she said firmly. "We're a family now, all of us, and we'll face whatever comes together." Tyrell wiped his eyes with his sleeve, and even Marcus managed a small smile. They returned to setting up the nursery, working together to create a warm, loving space for the twins. As evening settled in, Eleanor carefully laid Lily and Grace in their cribs. The mobile above them played a soft lullaby, and both babies drifted peacefully to sleep. She stood watching them, amazed by their tiny, perfect features and the miracle of their survival. Marcus and Tyrell appeared in the doorway, their faces soft in the nursery's dim light. Eleanor motioned them over, and they gathered around the cribs, a newfound family brought together by fate and courage. "They're so small," Tyrell whispered, gently touching Grace's tiny hand. Eleanor wrapped an arm around each boy's shoulders, holding them close as they watched the sleeping twins. Her heart felt full, remembering the long journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain of her past losses would always be there, but now she had a new purpose, a new family to love and protect. As she tucked the twins in for the night, Eleanor smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Eleanor pushed the twins' stroller toward Miller's Grocery, with Marcus and Tyrell walking beside her. The headlines about James Cartwright's arrest were plastered across the newspaper stand outside the store. People stopped to stare, but this time their looks held something different: respect, and maybe even a touch of shame. Inside the store, Mrs. Miller herself approached them, wringing her hands. "Boys," she said softly, "I owe you both an apology. We all jumped to conclusions, and that wasn't right." Marcus nodded politely while Tyrell shifted from foot to foot, unsure how to respond. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on each boy's shoulder. Later that evening, the community center buzzed with activity as residents filed in for the town meeting. Reverend Thompson, a respected community leader, stood at the podium discussing how James Cartwright's arrest had exposed deep-seated prejudices in their town. "We failed these young men," he said, gesturing to Marcus and Tyrell. "We let wealth and status blind us to the truth." When Eleanor took the podium, her voice carried clear and strong. "These boys risked their lives to save 2 innocent babies," she said. "They did what was right, even knowing they might be blamed. That's the kind of character we should celebrate in our community." People nodded in agreement, and several stood to share their own stories of misjudging others based on appearances or circumstances. Marcus and Tyrell sat quietly, taking it all in. Eleanor could see them processing this shift in perception, relief mixed with caution in their expressions. Mrs. Jones, sitting beside her grandsons, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, as neighbor after neighbor approached to offer kind words and support. Tyrell began to smile more openly, while Marcus maintained his characteristic thoughtfulness, acknowledging each person with quiet dignity. "Things are changing," Eleanor whispered to the boys, "but it's okay to take your time trusting that change." The meeting concluded with a standing ovation for Marcus and Tyrell. As they made their way toward the exit, community members lined the path, applauding and cheering. The boys walked tall beside Eleanor, finally feeling the warmth of acceptance from their neighbors. The autumn breeze whispered through the maple trees, scattering red and golden leaves across the cemetery grounds. Eleanor carefully pushed the double stroller carrying Lily and Grace along the winding path, while Marcus and Tyrell walked quietly beside her. The twins, now healthy and thriving, slept peacefully beneath their warm blankets. They stopped at Emily Cartwright's grave, where fresh flowers from recent visitors added splashes of color against the gray stone. Eleanor knelt beside the headstone, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of Emily's name. "Emily," she said softly, her voice catching slightly, "I want you to know that your daughters are safe and loved. I promise to raise them with all the care and protection you would have given them." She paused, wiping away a tear. "They'll always know how much their mother loved them." Marcus stood with his hands in his pockets, looking thoughtfully at the grave. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "that night changed everything for us, when we heard those cries coming from the car." He shook his head. "Saving Lily and Grace was the best decision we ever made." Tyrell, who had been unusually quiet, stepped forward. "I was so scared that night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now, looking at the twins, looking at our family," he glanced at Eleanor with grateful eyes, "I wouldn't change anything about what happened." Eleanor stood and wrapped an arm around each boy, pulling them close. Together, they placed a bouquet of white lilies on Emily's grave. The flowers seemed to glow in the early morning light, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Grace stirred in her sleep, making a small cooing sound that brought gentle smiles to their faces. Lily reached out in her sleep, grabbing her sister's tiny hand, a gesture that had become familiar since their time in the NICU. After a few moments of peaceful silence, they knew it was time to go. Marcus draped his arm around his younger brother's shoulders as they walked back toward the car, their footsteps crunching softly on fallen leaves. Eleanor followed behind with the stroller, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over them all. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened the crisp white envelope addressed to him. His eyes scanned the letter quickly, then again more slowly as a smile spread across his face. "I got in!" he exclaimed, his voice echoing through Eleanor's kitchen. Tyrell bounded down the stairs at his cousin's shout. "Got into what?" "The college prep program at State University." Marcus waved the acceptance letter. "Full scholarship for the summer session." Eleanor emerged from the twins' nursery, gently closing the door behind her. "That's wonderful news, Marcus." She pulled him into a warm hug. "We need to celebrate." Later that evening, Eleanor prepared a special dinner, Marcus's favorite lasagna with garlic bread. As they gathered around the table, Tyrell fidgeted with his napkin before clearing his throat. "I've got something to tell you, too," he said, his voice uncertain but determined. "I've been thinking about my future, watching Marcus work so hard." He pulled out a crumpled brochure from his pocket. "There's this apprenticeship program in graphic design. I want to apply." Marcus beamed at his cousin. "Tyrell, that's perfect for you. Remember all those amazing drawings you used to do?" "You still have quite an artistic eye," Eleanor added, remembering the beautiful mobile Tyrell had created for the twins' nursery. "I think you'd excel in graphic design." Over dinner, Eleanor shared practical advice about managing college courses and apprenticeships. She pulled out a notebook and helped the boys create basic budgets, showing them how to balance expenses with their part-time jobs. "You've taught us so much," Marcus said, looking at Eleanor with grateful eyes. "Not just about money and stuff, but about standing up for what's right." "And about family," Terrell added softly. "Real family." Eleanor raised her glass of sparkling cider. "To new beginnings and bright futures." Marcus and Terrell lifted their glasses too. "To Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice full of emotion, "the glue that holds our family together." Eleanor blinked back happy tears as their glasses clinked together, touched by their words and the love that filled the room. The local press club buzzed with activity as Eleanor, Marcus, and Terrell followed Clara through the crowded room. Terrell tugged at his borrowed tie, still uncomfortable in formal wear. Marcus walked tall beside him, though his eyes darted nervously around the unfamiliar space. "Why exactly are we here again?" Terrell whispered to Eleanor. "Clara just said it was important," Eleanor replied, squeezing his shoulder reassuringly. The room fell quiet as the press club president approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to honor exceptional journalism that makes a difference in our community." Clara sat at their table, fidgeting with her water glass. Eleanor noticed her usually confident friend seemed unusually nervous. This year's Excellence in Investigative Journalism Award goes to Clara Mitchell for her groundbreaking exposé of the Cartwright scandal, the president announced. Applause filled the room as Clara made her way to the podium. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "This award isn't really mine," Clara began, her voice strong and clear. "It belongs to 3 incredible people who taught me what true courage looks like." She gestured to their table. "Marcus and Terrell Jones, 2 young men who risked everything to save 2 innocent babies from a burning car. And Dr. Eleanor Hayes, who never stopped fighting for justice when everyone else looked the other way." Marcus and Terrell sat straighter in their chairs as Clara continued. "Their story isn't just about exposing corruption. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when no one believes you, even when you're scared." After the ceremony, Clara pulled Marcus and Terrell aside. "Your story matters," she told them earnestly. "It could help other kids who feel powerless against injustice. Think about sharing it." Eleanor approached Clara with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "We couldn't have done this without you." Clara hugged her tightly. "We make a pretty good team." As they walked to their cars afterward, Marcus turned to Terrell. "Maybe Clara's right. Maybe we could help other kids somehow?" Terrell nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, like maybe talking to kids at the community center about standing up for what's right." The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the park as Marcus and Terrell spread out a checkered blanket on the grass. Eleanor sat on a nearby bench, watching as the boys carefully lifted Lily and Grace from their stroller. "Look who's ready for their first park adventure," Terrell announced, making silly faces at Grace, who giggled and reached for his nose. Marcus cradled Lily gently, showing her a bright red leaf that had fallen nearby. "See this? It's called autumn. Everything changes colors, just like magic." Eleanor's heart swelled as she watched the scene unfold. The boys who had once been so uncertain around the twins now moved with natural confidence, their protective instincts evident in every gentle touch and watchful glance. Mrs. Peterson, their neighbor from 3 houses down, settled onto the bench beside Eleanor. "Those boys are something special," she said warmly. "The way they are with those little ones. It's beautiful to see." "They really are," Eleanor agreed, watching as Terrell pretended to be an airplane, making Grace squeal with delight. Other families at the park smiled at the sight of the teenage boys so tenderly entertaining the twins. A young mother pushing her toddler on the swings caught Eleanor's eye and nodded approvingly. "You've created something wonderful here," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Not everyone would have opened their heart the way you did. This town needs more examples like your family." Marcus was now holding both twins while Terrell snapped photos with his phone. "Hey, princesses," Marcus said softly to Lily and Grace. "Your big brothers are always going to be here for you, okay?" "Yeah," Terrell chimed in, tucking his phone away. "And you got the coolest big brothers ever. That's just facts." Eleanor stood up, knowing it was almost time for the twins' nap. As she approached the blanket, she felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. This unlikely family, born from tragedy but bound by love, had become her greatest blessing. The twins were starting to yawn as they packed up their things. Marcus and Terrell carefully secured them in the stroller, fussing over their blankets and making sure they were comfortable. Eleanor sat in the circle of mismatched chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Warm sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting a gentle glow across the faces of others who, like her, carried the weight of loss. "Would anyone like to share today?" the counselor asked, her voice soft and encouraging. Eleanor took a deep breath. "My name is Eleanor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, I lost my husband David and our daughter Sarah in a car accident." The words felt strange leaving her lips. She'd kept them locked away for so long. Outside in the waiting room, Marcus and Terrell sat side by side on a worn leather couch. "Remember when we first met her?" Terrell asked, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I thought she was just another person looking down on us." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, but she proved us wrong. She saw us, really saw us, when nobody else would." "She's like the mom we never had," Terrell admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Funny how things work out, right?" When Eleanor emerged from the session, her eyes were red, but her shoulders seemed lighter. The boys stood immediately, concern evident on their faces. "Thank you," she said, pulling them both into a tight hug. "I wouldn't have had the courage to do this without you two pushing me to face my grief." They drove home in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they walked through the front door, the sound of giggling drew them to the nursery, where Mrs. Jones was watching the twins. Lily and Grace were standing in their crib, holding onto the rails and laughing at each other's antics. Eleanor approached the crib, her heart full. She reached down to stroke Grace's cheek, then Lily's, before turning to look at Marcus and Terrell. "My life has purpose again because of all of you," she said softly. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair beside the twins' crib. The room was peaceful, lit only by a small nightlight casting star shapes on the ceiling. She watched her daughters sleeping soundly, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "Thank you, David and Sarah," she whispered into the quiet room. "Thank you for leading me here." Marcus stood at the entrance of the community college, his backpack feeling heavier than usual. The morning sun cast long shadows across the campus as other students hurried past. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door to his first college prep class. Inside, the classroom buzzed with nervous energy. Marcus chose a seat near the front, remembering Eleanor's advice about making the most of every opportunity. As the professor began discussing their semester goals, Marcus found himself raising his hand to contribute, surprising even himself with his eagerness. Across town, Terrell walked into the graphic design studio where he'd be apprenticing. His hands were slightly shaky as he introduced himself to Mr. Alvarez, a man with paint-splattered jeans and kind eyes. "Welcome, Tyrell. Mr. Alvarez said warmly. "Ready to dive into the world of design?" The studio walls were covered with vibrant artwork and sleek digital designs. Tyrell's eyes widened as Mr. Alvarez showed him around, explaining different techniques and sharing stories about his own journey as an artist. Back home that evening, Eleanor had prepared both boys' favorites, Marcus's beloved mac and cheese and Tyrell's favorite spicy chicken. The kitchen smelled amazing as they shared stories about their day. "I actually answered questions in class," Marcus said proudly. "And this girl, Sarah, asked if I wanted to join their study group. Mr. Alvarez showed me how to use these amazing design programs," Tyrell added, his eyes bright with excitement. "He said I have a natural eye for color." Eleanor beamed at them both. "I knew you'd find your way," she said, serving up generous portions. "Sometimes you just need to take that first step." The following weekend, Marcus and Tyrell started mentoring kids at the local community center. They shared their story of rescuing the twins and how it led them to find their path. "See, sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the best things in life," Marcus told a group of wide-eyed children. "Yeah," Tyrell chimed in, showing them some of his initial design sketches. "You just gotta be brave enough to try." As the day wound down, the brothers sat together on Eleanor's porch. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of children playing. "Pretty wild how things turned out," Tyrell said, leaning back in his chair. Marcus nodded, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Yeah, who would have thought that night would change everything?" They sat in comfortable silence, both thinking about how far they'd come and feeling hopeful about what lay ahead. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers hung colorful banners and arranged chairs. Eleanor adjusted Lily's tiny dress while Grace cooed contentedly in her carrier. The twins, now 7 months old, had grown into happy, healthy babies who brought joy to everyone they met. "Everything looks perfect," Eleanor said to Sarah, the event coordinator. "I can't believe how many people volunteered to help." Marcus and Tyrell stood near the entrance, fidgeting with their ties. They weren't used to being the center of attention, especially not in a positive way. "You boys clean up nice," Mrs. Peterson called out as she walked past with a tray of cookies. Just months ago, she had been one of their harshest critics. Now she beamed at them with genuine warmth. The community center filled quickly with familiar faces. Teachers, neighbors, and even some of Detective Nolan's colleagues came to show their support. Clara sat in the front row, notebook in hand, ready to document another positive chapter in this ongoing story. Eleanor approached the podium, her hand steady as she adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're here to celebrate second chances and the power of community." Her voice carried through the room as she shared their journey, from that terrifying night of the fire to the beautiful family they had become. There wasn't a dry eye in the house when she described how Marcus and Tyrell's bravery had not only saved 2 precious lives, but had also helped her heal from her own losses. When Marcus and Tyrell received their awards for heroism, the applause was thunderous. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his voice shaking slightly. "Thank you all. But especially thank you, Eleanor," he said, looking directly at her. "You didn't just give us a chance when others wouldn't. You gave us a home, a family, and a future we never thought possible." Tyrell nodded beside his brother, wiping tears from his eyes as he held Grace, who reached out to pat his face with her tiny hand. The photographer gathered them together, Eleanor holding Lily, Tyrell with Grace, and Marcus standing proudly between them. Their awards glinted in the camera flash, but their genuine smiles shone even brighter. Pink and purple balloons bobbed gently against the ceiling as Marcus stretched to hang the Happy First Birthday banner. Tyrell carefully arranged stuffed animals around the twins' high chairs, while Eleanor put finishing touches on a homemade birthday cake decorated with tiny butterflies. I can't believe it's been a year, Eleanor said softly, watching Lily and Grace play with colorful blocks on their blanket. Remember how tiny they were? Marcus smiled, stepping down from the ladder. Now look at them. As if on cue, Lily pulled herself up using the coffee table. Everyone held their breath as she wobbled, then took one tentative step forward. Grace, not to be outdone, followed her sister's lead. Their first steps together. "Oh my goodness!" Eleanor exclaimed, tears welling in her eyes. She reached for her phone to capture the moment, but her hands were shaking too much. "We got it," Terrell grinned, already recording. "But that's not all we've been working on." He nodded to Marcus, who disappeared into his room and returned with a carefully wrapped package. "What's this?" Eleanor asked, wiping her eyes as she accepted the gift. Inside was a handmade scrapbook, its cover decorated with photos of their unconventional family. Eleanor's breath caught as she opened to the first page, a newspaper clipping about the car fire, followed by hospital photos of the twins in the NICU. Page after page told their story. Marcus and Tyrell visiting the babies, Eleanor's adoption day, their first family photo, holidays together, everyday moments that had shaped them into a family. The final pages showed recent pictures of the twins playing, laughing, growing stronger every day. "Boys, this is..." Eleanor couldn't finish her sentence as fresh tears spilled over. "We wanted you to see how far we've all come," Marcus explained, his own voice thick with emotion. "How you gave us all a second chance at family." Terrell added, "And how those tiny babies we saved ended up saving us too." The simple dinner that followed was filled with laughter and stories. As Eleanor watched Marcus help Lily with her sippy cup while Tyrell made silly faces at Grace, she felt overwhelmed by how perfectly imperfect their family had become. Later, they gathered around the birthday cake, its candles casting a warm glow over their faces. The twins sat in their high chairs, eyes wide with wonder at the flickering lights. As they sang "Happy Birthday," Eleanor looked at each precious face, her boys, her babies, her family, and knew that sometimes the best gifts come in unexpected packages. The hospital auditorium buzzed with excitement as people filed in, admiring the extensive photo display that chronicled the twins' remarkable journey. Colorful banners celebrating community heroes hung from the ceiling, catching the light from the windows, and Eleanor sat in the front row with Lily and Grace on her lap, their matching pink dresses and ribbon-tied pigtails brightening the formal atmosphere. Clara approached the podium with confident steps, her journalist's notepad tucked away for once. She adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the gathered crowd, her voice clear and confident as it carried through the room. "A year ago, our community witnessed an extraordinary act of courage," she began, gesturing expressively. "Two young men chose to run toward danger instead of away from it. They didn't stop to consider the consequences or worry about what others might think. They simply acted to save two precious lives that night, showing us all what true heroism looks like." Marcus and Terrell shifted in their seats, their faces flushing as they remained unused to such praise. Clara continued, gesturing to the collection of touching photos behind her that show the family's journey. "But this story isn't just about one heroic night. It's about how tragedy can transform into triumph when people come together with open hearts. It's about Eleanor Hayes, who opened her heart and home without hesitation, showing us all what true family means in today's world." When Marcus and Tyrell took the stage together, their nervousness was visible in their tentative steps, but their words were steady and heartfelt. "We were just trying to do the right thing," Marcus said, glancing at Eleanor with deep affection. "But what we got in return was so much more than we could have imagined. We found a family, a real one, built on love and trust." Terrell nodded vigorously, adding, "Eleanor taught us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust someone else to help you." She showed us what it means to be truly strong." The hospital administrator, beaming with pride, presented Eleanor with a beautiful wooden plaque recognizing her extraordinary dedication to healing both bodies and hearts. As she accepted it, with trembling hands, the entire audience rose to their feet, applauding with genuine warmth and appreciation. Happy tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes as she looked out at the supportive crowd, then back at her beloved family. The twins clapped enthusiastically too, mimicking everyone else with delighted giggles, which made the audience laugh and applaud even harder. The ceremony concluded with a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever, filling the room with joy. As they made their way through the congratulatory crowd afterward, Marcus playfully nudged Tyrell's shoulder. "Remember when we used to be scared to come to this hospital?" he joked, his eyes twinkling. "Now we practically own the place," Tyrell grinned back, straightening his tie with exaggerated importance. Eleanor held the twins close against her sides, watching her boys with maternal pride as they accepted heartfelt congratulations from well-wishers. The plaque in her hands felt warm and solid, just like the steady glow of contentment that had taken permanent residence in her heart. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the living room floor, watching as Lily and Grace giggled over their wooden puzzle pieces. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting warm shadows across the carpet. She smiled as Grace triumphantly placed a piece in its correct spot, clapping her tiny hands with delight. The front door opened and Marcus burst in, his face glowing with excitement. "Eleanor, you won't believe how amazing the campus is." He dropped his backpack and joined them on the floor, careful not to disturb the twins' puzzle arrangement. "Tell me everything," Eleanor said, noting the spark in his eyes. "The science labs are incredible, and the professors I met." Marcus paused as Tyrell emerged from his room carrying his laptop. "Hey, little brother, wait till you hear about this place." "Hold that thought," Tyrell said, grinning. "I've got something to show everyone first." He turned his laptop around, revealing a beautifully designed logo on the screen. "My first paid project. The Community Hope Foundation loved my design." Eleanor leaned forward, admiring the intertwined hands forming a heart shape in soft blues and greens. "Tyrell, this is beautiful. You captured the spirit of our story perfectly." "That's what inspired me," Tyrell admitted, his voice soft. "Everything we've been through, how we came together. I wanted the logo to show how hope can grow from the hardest moments." Marcus squeezed his brother's shoulder. "You nailed it, bro." Eleanor watched her boys, because that's how she thought of them now, sharing their achievements, and felt her heart swell. Lily crawled into her lap, reaching for her necklace, while Grace continued working on the puzzle with fierce determination. "You know what?" Eleanor said, gathering everyone's attention. "I think it's time we celebrated properly. How about we plan that beach trip we've been talking about?" "Really?" Tyrell's eyes lit up. "Even with your busy schedule?" "Especially with my busy schedule," Eleanor replied. "We've all worked so hard, grown so much. We deserve this time together." The family gathered closer, discussing potential dates and activities. Marcus shared more details about his college tour between planning conversations, while Tyrell sketched quick doodles of beach scenes that made the twins squeal with delight. Watching them all together, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. "I never imagined," she said softly, "that one night could change everything so completely. Look at us now." "Best family ever," Tyrell declared, scooping up Grace and making her giggle. Marcus nodded, helping Lily with a particularly tricky puzzle piece. "We're pretty lucky." They spent the rest of the evening together in the living room, their conversation and laughter filling the space with warmth. The twins eventually dozed off on their playmat, while Marcus, Tyrell, and Eleanor continued sharing stories and dreams, their voices soft but full of joy. If you enjoyed the story of Marcus, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.